I have Dr. Helen Albertson here with me today to talk about the multi-generational workforce. Good morning, Helen.
Good morning. How are you today?
I'm great. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well, thank you.
Are you excited about this topic?
I am. It's one of my favorite topics to teach. So I like to get other people's opinions about what they believe are traits of generations, and then kind of show them that maybe they're not always correct. And there are a lot of good things about the generations that we work with.
Great. Let's start off by talking a little about you, your background, where are you coming from?
Well, I have been a instructor writer for almost a year now, and before that I was the Dean of Students at Loyola Law School, Los Angeles. I come with a very different background. I'm a retired naval reservist, spent almost 21 years as a reservist, and went to law school and had my doctorate in education. So I have all this different stuff going on that I brought with me, and I think it's helped me to be a better instructor writer here at AMSC.
Now let's talk about the multi-generational workforce and how that pertains to leadership, so one's ability to influence others. What are your thoughts?
The bottom line up front is that as a generation, we have certain traits and characteristics and influence how we are motivated at work, what motivates us, how we communicate, the respect that we give each other. And so all of these things are part of who we are. And just because we are part of a particular generation doesn't mean that we have all those characteristics. But if we understand the different characteristics of the generations, we can better work with our people, we can get along better, we can be high-performing teams, and we can influence decision-making in both from our superiors and from our peers.
What is a generation?
A generation is a group, we've referred to them also as cohorts, of about 15 to 20 years who have experienced events or circumstances that influence the way they think. It is usually in the formative years between 10 and 19 when some events occur that create a generation. So, for example, when we currently have 5 generations in the workforce. And the traditionalists are the people who were born before 1946. And so there's not very many of them left, but they were influenced by the Depression, by World War II. And so they have a different thought process than a person who was born as a millennial after 1997, who, grew up with technology and were influenced by Columbine and 9/11. And so all of these things create different thoughts and the way we see the world. And so if we can look at how we see the world and how others see the world and realize that not everybody thinks like I do, not everybody sees the world the same way I do. And so if we can work together and figure out how to work as a group, we're better able to create those high-performing teams at work.
Who gets to define these labels, these terms, whether we're talking about baby boomers, Generation X, millennials? Do you know the origin of these terms, these labels?
As we talked about earlier, Pew Research did a lot of work on defining generations over years. And the generations come up, depending upon who's talking about them, they might have different names. Traditionalists prior to 1945 or 1946, boomers from 46 to 64, Gen X 65 to 1980-ish, millennials 81 to 97, 96, and then Gen Z born after 97.
You said traditionalists. Is that synonymous with the silent generation?
Yes, it is. And in each generation, except boomers, have multiple names. Baby boomers are the only group that doesn't have another name. And the reason they're called baby boomers is because they were the largest generation in history. Because after World War II, soldiers came home, they had lots of children. Because the economy was booming and they were able to go back to school, get better jobs, and so they had more children. And then the Generation X came along, and as we talked about earlier, we talked about the invention of contraceptives, so there were fewer babies born. And so the Generation X came along, and they were this much smaller than the boomers. So they're also called the lost generation, the sandwich generation. And because after them came the millennials, another baby boom, not quite as big as baby boomers, but the millennials came along and people started having more children again. And so millennials are now were the most diverse generation in history until Generation Z came along, also known as iGen, who are now the most diverse generation in history.
So I was trying to gather some more information and do a little bit of research. I started at the Census Bureau. They don't officially recognize generations. They do recognize the statistical anomaly of the baby boomer generation increase in birth rates. It seems to be the Pew Research Center, a think tank in Washington, D.C., that seems to be doing most of
the naming conventions.
Well, that seems to be doing most of the analysis on this. It seems like most of the names, as I try to research this, actually come from authors. In 1991, two different books from two different authors came out. One of them was Douglas Copeland's book titled Generation X, Tales of Accelerated Culture, and explained that the letter X was just meant to signify the generation's desire not to be defined. It was a placeholder, but it stuck. In fact, Billy Idol used the name for his new band. Then there was another book in 1990 by Neil Howe. He's the one who coined the term the millennial generation, and he wrote that, co-authored that book with William Strauss. So in 1991, we get these two terms coming out, and it seemed like it seems like a lot of this desire to know and analyze these cohorts comes from the advertising agency, because they recognize the differences in what appeals to people, what appealed to a certain crowd with regards to advertising in a certain decade. It completely changed or evolved from decade to decade. And so advertising agencies are really motivated to stay on top of this. Pew Research Center 2015 say that an individual's age is one of the most common predictors of differences in attitude and behaviors. So with that said, a 20-year-old from the 1940s is going to be similar to a 20-year-old, let's say, from the 1990s, but there are also going to be some differences based on the environmental factors, the world events, technology.
A 20-year-old doesn't have the maturity of a 40-year-old, say. And so, yes, those age differences are consistent. We call a teenager wild and out of control, no matter what age they are.
And parents in the 40s were probably saying the same thing.
Yes, if you think about it, think about when rock and roll came alive, and parents said their students were listening to that crazy music. Well, 30 years later, students are listening to rap, and their parents are thinking, oh, they're listening to that crazy music. Mm-hmm. So there's a difference between age information and generation information. If we look at, youth at every age is youth. They're immature. They don't have the experience of the world. But if we look at generations, we look at what has influenced a generation. So as I talked about, the traditionalists were influenced by the Depression and World War II, and the boomers were influenced by what was going on in the 60s with the Vietnam War and the assassination of John F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy. And so those things influenced a generation. Millennials were influenced by Columbine and by 9/11. And we look at Gen Z, they are influenced by the school shootings that are going on all over the place. They are influenced by the fact that they're not being heard. And that's both a generational and an age issue. Is youth doesn't feel like they're being heard, but the Gen Z has reacted differently than previous generations, and they have become activists. And so, yes, it's age related, but it's also the influences of the generation that make them react differently.
Another influence that I see, I would be curious to hear your thoughts on this. I see egocentric thinking is also playing a part of this, and I've discussed that a little bit in our critical thinking episodes, but egocentric thinking, my point of view, my place, my experience, those somehow are a special reference point that are more important. For instance, looking back, the Beatles, the band, seems so tame. Both of my parents, having been product of the baby boomer generation, both described how their parents were actually mortified by that. This was the devil's music. These guys had long hair. This was going to be the...
I mean, think of I know you're too young to know this, but think about the appearance of Elvis Presley on the Ed Sullivan Show. And they only filmed him from the waist up because all that horrible dancing he was doing.
He was threatened with arrest for lewd behavior.
Yes. And so yes, that's an age thing. But the generational influence of the music explosion of the 60s created a whole generation who are more accepting of music than they were prior to that. So one of the things that we talk about in my classroom is about the cultural differences between generations and what influenced generations. Where I talked about events, but we also talk about movies and music and how that influenced the generation. So if we look at traditionalists, their movies were about men struggling to do the right thing. And I say men because early Hollywood was much about men. And so we think about 12 Angry Men, High Noon, all those kind of movies that had a man struggling to figure out, how do I do the right thing? Where we go into the boomers, it was fighting the system. So I was listening to the radio on my way to work this morning. They were talking about Network. And a lot of people don't know that movie. It's from 1975. It was an angry man fed up with the system, and now it's being made into a Broadway play, starring Bryan Cranston. And so it was a rejection of the establishment. So then we look at Generation X, and their movies were about anti-heroes. And so we think of The Matrix. We think of Breakfast Club. And so those kind of movies were like, I'm really going to reject the system now. I'm going to go my own way. And then we look at millennials, and their movies are kid heroes. You think about Harry Potter and kids saving the world, Percy Jackson, those kind of movies. They're all revolved about how, this kid saved their parents, saved the world. And now we're looking at Gen Z, and, because of their age, it's all family-related movies. And so we look at the progression of movies and how it influenced the generation. And so we look to the future and saying, well, what is going to influence the next generation? It's hard to say at this point, but I'm sure that movies and music will have a lot of influence. And we can look at the music as in the same way that we look at the movies, because the music, if we think about the 40s, it was big band era and solo acts, Frank Sinatra, Bing Crosby. And then we look at the boomers' music, it was the Beatles, it was the Doors, very, very anti-establishment. And Elvis Presley was part of that as well. We look at Gen X, and it was grunge and alternative music. And millennials has become a mix of music from rap and hip hop and techno and electronic, and they just have a whole range of music that they're listening to. And so it's all a progression of the solo artist up to it's techno, which has no live musicians. So it's a very interesting concept of how we understand a generation through their music and movies.
Well, we were recently going through some training where the instructor had brought up a bunch of historic magazines, Lifetime magazines, National Geographic from the 30s, 40s. And as we were thumbing through them, I stumbled across an editorial where the person was concerned about the youth losing horsemanship abilities. The youth can no longer mount a horse. We've all become reliant on tractors on the farm and vehicles. And what's the world going to become now when our youth can't even mount a horse? I recently heard in my classroom from a student, to her despair, her grandkids were 10 years old and didn't know how to tie a shoe. What's the world going to become? Coming back to the egocentric point of view, what I grew up with is important and will remain important and remain relevant. And if those coming up in younger generations don't value those same things or don't have those same skills and abilities, my goodness, I've heard the new generation doesn't know how to drive a manual transmission.
Oh, yeah.
What's the world coming to. That's where I think we need to break out of that. And this is where this could be useful in looking at the strengths that each generation brings and versus the differences. Really, these days in the United States, how many cars can you buy with a manual transmission? Is it really the end of the world?
And that's what we look at when we look at multi-generational workforce, because what one generation finds important, and I'll use the example of communication. Traditionalists communicate face-to-face, they communicate in writing. They wrote letters, beautiful letters, and mailed them with stamps on them. And we look at the millennials and Gen Z don't even know how much a stamp costs because they don't mail letters anymore. But that traditionalist is looking at that, well, those people don't even know how to write. And the millennials are looking at, that person doesn't even know how to text. And that's how I communicate. And so we have this gap in communication styles. And how hard is it for a millennial to get up and walk across the room to talk to the baby boomer or the traditionalist? How hard is it for the traditionalist or the baby boomer to learn to text their coworker? And so when those things create conflict, it makes for a difficult work environment. And so if we can understand that one generation likes to communicate in one way, and I can adapt a little bit to say, hey, I can learn to communicate that way as well, it will create those high-performing teams that we're looking for at work. And communication is just one example. I talk about this in my class, but one of the conflict areas is dress code. The traditionalists wore the three-piece suits, and women wore skirts and stockings and high heels. The boomers dressed like their bosses, and the Gen Xers are well, why can't I just wear khakis and a polo shirt? And the millennials are, why can't I wear pajama pants? And we joke about the pajama pants and flip-flops, but what difference does it make what we are wearing? If we are not a customer-facing organization, why can't we wear pajama pants and flip-flops? Other than the fact that it drives our coworkers crazy. Respect is another example. The millennials don't understand, well, I have the knowledge of this subject. Why don't you respect my knowledge? Or the traditionalists, well, the boss is the boss, so we should give them respect because they are the boss. And so when the different generations look at respect, it also creates conflict in the organization.
Along those lines, one trend that I've noticed in the workplace is it seems that the traditionalists, when they were still in the workforce, or the baby boomers, seem to value tenure more, versus the younger folks seem to value ability. What can you do? And that seems to be what matters more. And I see that clashing sometimes as well.
Right. When we think about loyalty to the organization, the traditionalists worked in the same company for 35 years and then retired and got a gold watch.
And a pension.
And the boomers are looking at it as, well, I have earned my way up to promotion, and so wait your turn. And the Gen Xers and millennials are saying, hey, I have the knowledge, so listen to me because I have the knowledge. Where we look at boomers who are, think that knowledge is power, and so they hoard it. Where Xers and millennials and Gen Zs coming up, they look at power, yes, knowledge is power, but only if you share it. And so that creates a conflict as well. And we look at, it does really hinge on boomers now because there's so many of them getting ready to retire and all the knowledge that they have that they are not sharing. And so we have to figure out, how do we get them to share that knowledge with the millennials and the Gen Xers and the Gen Zs, because we learn differently by generation. If you think about boomers and traditionalists did on-the-job training, and then boomers created manuals so that we would know how to do things, and Gen Xers, they're the MTV generation, and so they looked at videos, and now millennials look at YouTube. You can learn anything on YouTube if you are open to learning that way. But as boomers and traditionalists we're not that comfortable with the YouTube learning that millennials are, and so it creates again a conflict in learning styles.
I'm seeing demographics on just who listens to this podcast, and yeah, there seems to be an age cutoff point.
Yeah. It's this is what we grew up with. This is what was going on in our formative years, and so that is what creates the generation, and it creates also the belief that I am correct, and we go back to the egocentric thinking. Well, this is the way I've always done it, so of course it's correct, and it works for each generation.
I see that as the biggest barrier to a multi-generational workforce, the egocentric thinking. My frame of reference is right. I'm a Generation X, and I grew up as a free-range kid. At the age of 5, I was walking to school, walking home, letting myself in with the key. I was a latchkey kid. Mm-hmm. Parents were divorced, and I was young. It forced some independence on my part. Now I see this young generation with helicopter parents, and they can't do anything on their own without their hand being held. They're getting a trophy for everything. Very different than how I grew up, and it's wrong because it's different.
And we can blame the boomers for that. And being a boomer myself, I understand. I didn't let my kids walk to school. I didn't even let them cross the street till they were 12. And so it's a different way of parenting that has created what we see are the negatives in the millennials. But you know what? Millennials get a bad rap. They are more innovative. They're more likely to create organizations that help people. They are more likely to volunteer because they grew up in a world that, again, influenced by Columbine, influenced by 9/11. They grew up thinking that life is fragile. And so I want to make a difference, and I want to do it now. I don't have time to wait. And so they get this bad rap for being what we call entitled or privileged or helicopter, or whatever you want to call it. But they're not like that. They are, if we look at the companies that have been created by millennials, Facebook, we look at those organizations that have come alive because of millennials, organizations that are helping the world and creating things that improve our world. And so I always like to tell people that, we have all these negative beliefs about millennials, but it's negative beliefs based on their youth, not on their skills.
From the millennials' point of view, I sometimes see them as talking down to the older generation. Look, I have to go help them turn on their computer.
Yeah.
I have to show them how to create a PowerPoint presentation.
I have to show them how to stop their VCR from blinking because they don't know how to fix the time. And they still have VCRs. What is that?
Admittedly, our 1988 VCR had like 30 steps to get the clock to stop blinking 12 o'clock. But yeah.
And the millennials can't understand. We have all this technology. Why aren't you embracing it? But they grew up with it, so they are digital natives. I didn't get my first cell phone till I was in my 40s. My daughters got them when they were 13. But this Gen Z, they've had them since they were 2 or 4, and they work with iPads all the time, and so they understand all of this technology that previous generations didn't have. And they can't understand, I've got the world at my fingertips, and we complain that, they're always looking at their phones, but they are learning from their phones. They're looking up, words they don't understand. They're looking up organizations that provide more information. And yes, we complain about that, but it's the way of the future, and we need to adapt to it as well.
I think that sometimes the older generation sees that as a vulnerability, because what can you do if it breaks? What happens if the Russians take out the satellites? I went to flight school, Fort Rucker, in the late 90s, and GPS was still a relatively new thing in Army aircraft, and most of our instructor pilots were still the Vietnam War era, and they did not like us relying on GPS. That's not going to be there. You need to know how to read a map, because what are you going to do when it's broken? But with GPS, it is actually fairly reliable. They have a point, but I can do a lot more. Also, a recent change that I've seen in the Army is the reliance now on the institutional knowledge as we start to come out, the decade of war and looking at how did we used to do things, because we kind of got caught up in the whole, the counterinsurgency fight. And a lot of the younger officers, they weren't around during
Right.
that. And so now we're having to rely on institutional knowledge and talk to those quote unquote old timers who did it before the Army changed direction. Before I think the entire DoD changed direction, their focus on terrorism. How do we go back to really what our core competencies should be in how we engage in near peer threat? And so I see the older generation as having a huge part.
It's that transfer of knowledge. And again, if we look at the Gen Xers are now becoming the leaders in the active side of the Army. The boomers are still the leaders on the civilian side because us boomers, we're very competitive. We had to fight for everything because there were so many of us, and so we've carried that on to our later years, and now we are not leaving. We're holding on to our jobs for longer because we are taking care of our parents, we're taking care of our children. We either haven't been able to save, or we just haven't saved enough to retire on our own. So we're continuing to work. And the Gen Xers and the millennials are like, will you just retire? Because we want to make changes and we want to improve things. And yet, and as I said, boomers are knowledge hoarders. And so they're not sharing that institutional knowledge yet. And as they get closer and closer to retirement, the workforce in the next 7 to 8 years, the workforce is going to change dramatically because most of the boomers will be retiring by then. And almost half the workforce by 2025 will be millennials. And so we look at what are we sharing and how can we get people to share? And that's where understanding generational differences comes into play, is if we know our people and know what motivates them and know what knowledge they have, what knowledge they will share, then we can make a better transition to a younger generation workforce.
At the end of the day, what advice would you have for leaders using knowledge of, I guess, the differences of others without going into a hasty generalization, but to recognize and value differences to better influence?
I guess my best advice would be know your people. Again, if it goes back to knowing what motivates them, whether it's generational differences or age differences or family situation differences, knowing what motivates people can help them to be more committed to the organization. We can get compliance every day of the week. Do this because I'm their boss and you have to do it. But when you can get commitment from your people to the organization and to the leader, then you can get more work from the entire generation, from the entire office, from the entire team. And you can't do that if you don't know your people. So take the time to understand generational differences, but to understand individuals, because everyone is an individual and different things motivate them.
My advice to the old timers would be, before you start criticizing the younger generations, remember there was a generation that preceded you that was criticizing you for losing your horsemanship skills.
Absolutely.
And you did just fine.
Yeah.
And for the younger generations who might be looking down on the old timers, well, look at the path that they paved. You wouldn't be here without the steps that they placed. Absolutely.
You have to appreciate the generational differences. Understanding them is one thing, but appreciating them is quite different. And if you can do that, you'll have a high-performing team. You'll have a high-performing organization.
I appreciate the conversation, Helen.
Thank you. I appreciate being here.
And we welcome your feedback. Please write us at usarmy.leavenworth.tradoc.mbx.amsc-podcast@mail.mil, or you can just write us at amscpodcast@gmail.com.